Christmas Eve 2019. In one of London's most exclusive neighbourhoods, the sound of laughter drifted through the cold night air. Fairy lights twinkled in the windows, children's voices carried from decorated homes, and the streets of Battersea were quiet, almost too quiet. Then, without warning, the stillness was ripped apart. A sudden burst of gunfire, 8, 9, maybe 10 shots echoed through the narrow streets. In seconds, the festive calm had turned into chaos. On the doorstep of a £1.7 million townhouse, a young mother's scream pierced the night. Neighbours rushed out, stunned to see what had unfolded. Christmas lights blinked on, casting an eerie glow on a scene that belonged not to holiday cheer, but to something far darker. Who could unleash such violence in a place like this, and on this night of all nights? And why was Flamur Beqiri, the man who lay bleeding at his doorstep, targeted with such brutal precision? The answers would drag investigators into a world far removed from London's holiday warmth, a world of rivalries, shadows and secrets, stretching far beyond these quiet streets. The scene on that Battersea doorstep left police and neighbours shaken, but as investigators began piecing together the victim's life, it became clear that Flamur Beqiri was no ordinary family man caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. A Swedish citizen with Albanian roots, Beqiri had left Malmö behind in 2016, settling in London with the image of a rising entrepreneur. To friends and colleagues, he was the co-founder of 2020 Records, an independent label with offices in both London and Stockholm. To his wife, Deborah, he was a devoted husband, the man she had married in a lavish Lake Como wedding only a year before. By the time of the shooting, they were raising 2 small children together. From the outside, it looked like a picture of success and stability, but beneath that polished exterior lay something far darker. Court hearings later revealed that Beqiri's past was not defined by music or family life, but by shadows stretching across Europe. Since at least 2007, he had been linked to large-scale narcotics trafficking, a world of vast profits and violent consequences. In Sweden, he had already been named in a £2 million smuggling case. His circle included not just musicians and producers, but men like Tamer Zahran, a convicted arms trafficker caught smuggling more than 200 firearms into the country. Associations like these told their own story. Beqiri was deeply embedded in a dangerous underworld, one where enemies were inevitable and eliminations were often just a matter of time. So, was the man gunned down on Christmas Eve a devoted father, or a marked target who had been running from his past? But his name was not only whispered in criminal circles. Beqiri also had a tie to a celebrity. His sister, Mise Beqiri, was a Swedish-born model and television personality from the Real Housewives of Cheshire. She had once been married to former Manchester United goalkeeper Anders Lindegaard, and her glamorous lifestyle often made headlines. That connection meant when news of Flamur's death broke, the story moved beyond police files and underground networks within hours. It splashed across international tabloids, casting the story of a violent doorstep ambush into the world of celebrity gossip. Yet to those who had watched Malmö's criminal feuds escalate for years, this was never about a reality star's brother. It was another move in a gangland conflict stretching across borders. A conflict where past grudges had long memories and blood was often the only currency of revenge. So how did a man balancing family, music and notoriety become the target of such a calculated strike on a London street? To understand that, we need to trace the lines of loyalty and betrayal that followed him from Sweden to Britain. To understand why Beqiri's name ended on a killer's list, investigators had to look back to Malmö, the city where he grew up and where shadows seemed to follow him long before London. By the late 2010s, Malmö had become a city scarred by violence. Gunfire rattled through residential blocks, grenade attacks shook the nights, and behind it all were feuds between rival crime networks. At the centre of one faction stood Daniel Johansson Petrovsky, better known as Danny J. Despite the nickname Danny the Jew, though he was not Jewish, Petrovsky was no street hustler. He lived in a penthouse perched atop the Tuming Torso skyscraper, symbols of wealth scattered around him, including a yacht anchored on Spain's coast. This was the world where Beqiri belonged. He and his childhood friend Naif Udawi were trusted players in Petrovsky's empire. Udawi himself carried a reputation as one of Scandinavia's most audacious criminals, serving 8 years for masterminding Denmark's largest bank robbery, a €10 million heist that still echoes in European criminal history. Together, Petrovsky, Beqiri, Udawi, and their allies dominated the narcotics trade in southern Sweden. It was a world of enormous profits, but also of escalating dangers, because across the divide, another name was rising, a rival with ambition, violence, and no intention of backing down. And it was this rivalry that would set into motion the chain of events leading to a London doorstep on Christmas Eve. On the other side of this battlefield stood Flamur Beqiri, Danish-born of Moroccan heritage. Beqiri was barely into his 20s, but already carried the reputation of a predator. His crew, known as Los Suecos, the Swedes, operated out of Spain's Costa del Sol, running narcotics, carrying out assassinations, and forging links with Europe's most feared crime lords, including Dutch-Moroccan kingpin Ridwan Taghi. Police would later say Beqiri brought new brutality to Malmö's conflicts, and it showed. After a veteran crime boss was eliminated in 2018, Beqiri surged to fill the void. What began as competition over shipments of coke and cannabis quickly spiraled into kidnappings, torture, and targeted killings. The feud turned grotesque that summer. A young relative of Daniel Petrovsky was kidnapped in Malmö. He was held for 3 days and was released with a Star of David carved into his back, a cruel reference to Petrovsky's nickname Danny the Jew. The act went beyond violence. It was humiliation, a message carved into flesh. The cycle of revenge escalated. On the 26th of August 2019, daylight horror struck. A 31-year-old doctor, Caroline Hakim, was gunned down while holding her 2-month-old baby. Witnesses stood frozen as the gunman fired into her body, while her partner fled in terror with the infant in his arms. Hakim was not an arbitrary target. She was the partner of Udawi. The assassins had missed him, so they killed her instead. A Swedish prosecutor later remarked on the symbolism. Hakim was executed cradling her child, eerily similar to the way Beqiri would later be shot in front of his wife and toddler. The message was unmistakable. We can strike anywhere, at anyone, even your loved ones. Encrypted EncroChat messages later revealed Udawi's fury. Using the alias Stiefherb, he vowed, they chose to murder a woman, so now they're going to have me in the game. Vengeance is coming. By the end of 2019, vengeance had become the language of both factions. High-ranking figures were marked for elimination, and associates like Beqiri could no longer escape the gravity of the war. As the prosecutors later testified that violence between the two gangs, including kidnapping and murder, escalated from the middle of 2018, and by the following summer, both Udawi and Mr. Beqiri had become targets. By then, Beqiri's name was already etched onto a hit list. By 2016, threats in Malmö had escalated to the point that Beqiri abruptly left Sweden. Police sources later hinted that a falling out inside his circle had sparked a conflict he could not contain. London, with its anonymity, offered temporary cover. But geography could not erase enemies. The rivalries he left behind were international, their reach extending far beyond Malmö's streets. From the moment of his killing, British investigators coordinated with Swedish police, convinced this was no random act, but a hit ordered from abroad. Beqiri seemed to sense the danger. At his Battersea home, he installed state-of-the-art CCTV, a silent acknowledgement that safety could never be taken for granted. Yet, on Christmas Eve, after an evening out with his wife and children, he returned home unaware that a gunman was already waiting in the dark. But Beqiri's enemies had not forgotten him. They had only grown patient. By late 2019, his elimination was entrusted to a man who on paper seemed the unlikeliest of killers. Anis Hemisi was just 22 years old. A Swedish-Tunisian national, a professional kickboxer with no prior criminal record. Not a career gangster, but a gun for hire, deadly skills disguised beneath a clean facade. Hemisi and his crew treated London like hostile terrain. For nearly 6 months they studied every angle, rehearsed every movement, and mapped every escape. Nothing in this sequence was improvised. Every step was carefully choreographed. Operatives slipped in and out of the city like phantoms. One associate, Esteban Alexis Pino Munizaga, flew in for just 14 hours in November 2019, enough time to rent a flat at Oyster Wharf, a riverside complex within sight of Beqiri's home, and to scout the neighbourhood. He also purchased a woman's bicycle with a basket. Another conspirator acquired a long-handled litter picker. Innocuous items, but in this plot every detail had a purpose. And then came the disguise. On the 21st of December, 3 days before the killing, Battersea residents noticed something odd. A street cleaner, unfamiliar with the neighbourhood, wanders the pavements. CCTV later revealed the truth. It was Hemisi, dressed in a neon high-visibility jacket, dark beanie, sunglasses, and even a prosthetic mask. He pushed the bicycle along the street. In his hand, the litter picker. In his bag, tools of deception. He bent, picked at the ground, moved slowly, mimicking the mundane act of collecting rubbish. But his real task was far darker. He was watching, recording, measuring the steps that would end a man's life. The disguise might have worked. In his neon jacket with a litter picker and basketed bicycle, Hemisi looked just like another council worker, blending into the background. But there was something off. Jeremy Lyons, a local dog walker, noticed the man sweeping not just public streets, but even a private gated estate, an unlikely duty for a real sanitation worker. Suspicion sharpened. Lyons walked straight up and demanded, "Excuse me, who do you work for?" Hemisi's response was mumbled, evasive. With no cover story to fall back on, he was exposed. Lyons pressed harder. "Get away from this estate, please." Cornered, Hemisi abandoned the charade. The bicycle was left behind, and the neon jacket was discarded. The assassin slipped away into the night. But the plot did not end there. This was a team prepared for setbacks. Within hours, another accomplice, Bawe Carrara, secured a replacement bike. The disguise had been compromised, but Hemisi still had his mask and his weapon. The mission was only postponed. 3 days later, on Christmas Eve, Hemisi returned. No fluorescent jacket this time, just dark clothing and the mask. He waited in silence outside Battersea Church Road, watching the townhouse where Flamur lived. At around 9 o'clock, Flamur walked home with his wife and children. As he reached his front door, the killer struck. A 9mm pistol spat fire. 10 shots in rapid succession. 8 bullets tore into Beqiri's back before he collapsed bleeding on the threshold. Hemisi did not linger. He fled with precision, first on foot, then onto the replacement bicycle, speeding along the riverside path into the darkness. In minutes, he was gone. What remained was a scene of horror. A man dying in his wife's arms, their toddler crying amid the screams, bullet castings glittering in the Christmas lights. But Amici had not vanished completely, because as he pulled the trigger, cameras were watching. Beqiri's own high-end CCTV caught the flashes, and across London, the city's vast surveillance web was already tracing the assassin's escape. Within minutes of the incident, detectives from the Metropolitan Police's Specialist Crime Command descended on Battersea Church Road. The scale of the operation told its own story. This was not senseless brutality. Detective Inspector Jamie Stevenson stood before reporters just days later. His words hinted at what investigators already suspected. "We believe Flamur may possibly have been involved in some criminality in Sweden, and we are liaising with our Swedish counterparts to understand what incidents might have led to someone seeking retribution against Flamur in the UK." That theory proved chillingly accurate. The Christmas Eve ambush bore all the marks of a targeted strike, and the killers, meticulous as they were, had overlooked one powerful enemy: London's surveillance network. In Sweden, CCTV cameras aren't as common due to restrictions, but in London, cameras are everywhere. Detectives knew if they could gather enough footage, they might unravel the path of the assassin, and so, frame by frame, they built the story backwards. They traced a masked figure pedaling a bicycle away from the murder scene, following the trail along the riverbank, then into the courtyard of Oyster Wharf, the very apartment complex scouted weeks earlier. The safe house, the killer's base of operations. On Christmas Day itself, just hours after Flamur's execution, surveillance cameras captured two men hauling a large suitcase out of an apartment rented under a false name. Their identities would soon be revealed: Clifford Rollocks, a 31-year-old Londoner, and Claude Isaac Castor, also 31, from Saint Martin in the Caribbean. Local recruits were brought in to erase the traces of the crime. But they were too late. Police raided the flat before the cleanup was complete. Inside, investigators uncovered damning fragments, evidence hurriedly torn apart, and among it the stub of an airline ticket. A single name stared back at them: Anis Amici. The assassin had vanished into the night, but this paper trail remained. The ripped airline ticket bearing Hanisi's name was the thread that unravelled everything. While Metropolitan Police scoured Oyster Wharf, Swedish investigators were already moving. On December the 25th, barely a day after the killing, officers in Malmö were coordinating with Scotland Yard, cross-checking intelligence and narrowing down suspects. Coordinating with Malmö police, detectives used the ticket stub to pull flight manifests and CCTV timestamps, reconstructing the team's exit route and solidifying the case for an arrest warrant of Anis Fuad Amici. But Amici was already gone. In the early hours of Christmas morning, just hours after the armed attack, he boarded a Eurostar to France, slipped into Denmark, and boarded a flight to Thailand. There he rang in the new year under palm trees, convinced he had escaped justice. For 3 weeks he vacationed, unaware that an international dragnet was closing in around him. On January the 20th, 2020, his luck collapsed. As soon as his return flight landed at Copenhagen's Kastrup Airport, Danish officers boarded the plane. Acting on a European arrest warrant, they pulled the 22-year-old hitman from his seat before he even touched his luggage. Stunned, Amici could only watch as his careful choreography unravelled. During questioning, his story shifted from violence to absurdity. He denied everything, claiming he had come to London only to watch Netflix and chill, insisting he had never heard of Beqiri. But the evidence, CCTV footage, travel records, digital communications and forensics, spoke louder than his words. By June 2020, Hemisi was extradited to the UK to face murder and firearms charges, and the net kept tightening. In October that year, Swedish police arrested 3 more suspects, Esteban, Tobias Andersson and Carrere, all linked to the hit squad. Meanwhile, 2 London-based accomplices, Clifford Rollox and Claude Isaac Castor, were tied to the clean-up effort. Yet, even with these arrests, one figure remained in the shadows, Ahmet Carrere, cousin of Bauer, accused of bankrolling and organising the assassination. He vanished abroad, wanted by police, his name lingering like an echo behind the murder. By then, the Metropolitan Police called the case one of the most complex murder inquiries in recent history, a web of narcotics networks, contract assassins, and international financiers, and at its centre, a Christmas Eve ambush that left a family shattered on a quiet London street. By late 2021, the case reached Southwark Crown Court. For nearly 2 months, jurors sat through a grim reconstruction of how a Swedish gang feud spilled blood on a London street. Prosecutor Louise Attrill described it plainly: a tit-for-tat rivalry between 2 very significant organised crime groups. Beqiri, they argued, was no innocent prey. He had posed as a record label boss, but in reality he was a central figure in Petrovsky's narcotics empire. Alongside Adawi, he was named as one of the syndicate's key players, a man whose past could never be separated from the violence that stalked him. The feud with Beqiri's gang had already claimed lives in Sweden. In December 2019, it reached London. The evidence was devastating. Jurors were shown the CCTV footage of that Christmas Eve. Beqiri walking home, holding his young son's hand, his wife just behind him. Then, out of the shadows, Hemisi appears. The mask, the pistol, 10 shots in less than 5 seconds. Flamur collapsing at his own doorstep. His wife's screams cutting through the night. Other clips revealed Hemisi's rehearsal days earlier, his disguise as a council worker, his high-vis jacket, the latex mask, every movement calculated, every step deliberate. The cold premeditation left little doubt as to intent. When his turn came, Hemisi tried to spin another story. He denied everything, saying his only plan in London was to take it easy in front of the TV. He claimed he had never even heard of Beqiri and that his time in the city was spent strolling, relaxing, and wasting time. But the jury had already seen him, caught on camera in disguise outside Beqiri's home. His words rang hollow against the flickering images. There was more that the jurors never heard. Behind closed doors, the court was told Hemisi had once been a suspect in another Swedish gangland attack near his father's home in Malmö. He had not been charged, but the shadow of violence had followed him long before Battersea. Inside the courtroom, the facade crumbled. The picture emerging was not of coincidence or chance, but of a cross-border contract killing, executed with precision and now replayed in harrowing detail for 12 silent jurors. Inside Southwark Crown Court, the story of Beqiri's death unfolded like a crime thriller retold in cold fact. Prosecutors described a 4-man murder commando dispatched from Sweden to London with a single purpose: to eliminate Beqiri. The roles were laid bare. Esteban handled logistics, renting the safe house and procuring the bicycle. Tobias Andersson and Carrere supplied equipment, and prosecutors argued acted as lookouts or backup. And at the centre of it all, Anis Hemisi, the trained kickboxer, the man in the latex mask, the one who pulled the trigger. Telephone records, travel documents, and surveillance footage wove the threads of their conspiracy together, showing a network moving with military precision. Hovering above it all was the ghost of Beqiri. Though not on trial, his name was everywhere in the background. The jury was told how Beqiri's feud with Petrovski's network had erupted into kidnappings and executions, culminating in the hit on Beqiri. By then, both gang leaders had already fallen, Petrovski serving time in Sweden, Beqiri arrested in Dubai and held in Spain. As one Swedish superintendent testified, most of the Petrovski people are in custody. Beqiri is in custody in Spain together with his closest associates. The war that claimed Flamur had burned itself out, leaving ashes and prison cells behind. The most harrowing evidence was visual. Jurors were forced to watch CCTV footage of the ambush itself. Beqiri arriving home with his wife and child, only to be cut down by Hamisi's pistol in a matter of seconds. Other clips showed Hamisi's dry run days before, disguised as a street cleaner, stalking the same pavement. The horror was undeniable. When Hamisi took the stand, he clung to his flimsy defense. He had never heard of Beqiri, he insisted. The jury had already seen him in disguise outside the target's door. His story dissolved under the weight of the images. After 2 months of testimony, the verdict came in February 2022. Hamisi was found guilty of murder and firearms possession. Pino Munizaga, the fixer, was acquitted of murder, but convicted of manslaughter for his role in the plot. Anderson and Correa walked free, the jury unconvinced beyond a doubt of their part. The local accomplices, Rolox and Castor, had already been dealt with, guilty of trying to erase the evidence. The trial stripped away every disguise, every false narrative. What remained was the stark truth. Flamur Beqiri's death was neither random nor spontaneous. It constituted an international execution, the final act of a feud that began in Malmö and ended at a London doorstep. On the 18th of February 2022, the courtroom fell silent as Justice Chima Grubb delivered her sentence. She called the crime what it was, an audacious execution born of a global gang rivalry. Turning to the young hitman in the dock, she said, "There is no doubt that aged just 22, with no previous convictions, in 2019 you were a gun for hire. This was international crime at its most brutal. For that brutality, Anis Hamisi received life in prison with a minimum of 35 years before he could even be considered for release. By the time he walks free, if he ever does, he will be an older man. Decades stolen by the choice to kill for money." Esteban, the fixer who secured the safe house and bicycle, was sentenced to 15 years for manslaughter. The clean-up crew, Clifford Rolox and Claude Castor, each received 3 years for tampering with evidence, their roles minor but still vital to the plot. Anderson and Correa walked free, the jury unconvinced beyond a doubt of their part, yet their freedom was fragile. Back in Sweden, most of Petrovski's network was already behind bars. Across Scandinavia, the war that had spilled onto London's streets was collapsing under the weight of arrests. Hadawi and Petrovski were serving prison terms for narco offences, even as prosecutors pursued them for revenge plots. Beqiri, the rival boss whose name lingered like a shadow over every hearing, sat in a Spanish cell. The feud that left Beqiri dead had burned itself out, its leaders caged, its soldiers scattered. But in court, Justice Chima Grubb reminded everyone that behind the headlines and the gangland intrigue stood something far more fragile, a family destroyed. Flamur Beqiri was also a son, a partner, and a father, she told the jury. His children would grow up never knowing their father. His wife Deborah would raise them alone. His sister Mise would grieve not as a reality star, but as a sister who lost her brother in a pool of blood. In the end, the human cost dwarfed the criminal spectacle. A family shattered, children scarred by a memory they were too young to understand, and a Christmas Eve in Battersea forever marked by an ambush that carried Malmö's gang war across borders. proving that even half a continent away, Beqiri could not escape the reach of revenge.